Welcome to Health Stealth Radio, where we move away from the mundane to gather insights from the shadows of enterprise and patient cybersecurity. Yes, we surely believe that traditional themes like endpoint software and zero trust are critical, but given massive advances in AI, remote and wearable device hacking, and data hostage negotiators, there's a much darker side to cybersecurity, and not everyone is quite willing to talk about it in public. Health Stealth Radio will thrive on these topics and encourage fireside spats to debate them. Here's your host, Frank Cutitta.
I'd like to welcome you to Health Stealth Radio. This is a program, as you know, that largely focuses on the shadows of cybersecurity, both on the patient and the enterprise side, but sometimes we like to dally around into other areas. Today, I have to admit that in the spirit of full disclosure, I have one of my dearest friends for the last over 35 years, David Moschella. We've worked very closely together over the years. We were both apostles of the legendary Pat McGovern. David ran the research operation at IDG, and I was running international there. So we got to travel around the world together, and then had a couple other stops together shortly after that at Computer Sciences, which then became, what is it?
DXC.
DXC, I can never get it. I get DXL, which is the Fat Boy clothing store that I shop at. And then their leading edge forum research group, where we were both researchers. Dave headed up the operation there, and he gave me the luxury of writing some research with him. So today we're going to talk about Dave's book and his co-author's book. It's a mouthful. I tried to memorize it, but I'm going to have to read it. It's Technology, Fears, and Scapegoats, 40 Myths about Privacy, Jobs, AI, and Today's Innovation Economy. So we've got a lot to talk about here. We usually don't get guests that have 40 things that they've already documented to talk about, but Dave has done that. He's a really, really smart guy, and if you want to hang around with smart people, Dave's one of the guys to do it with. So I'd like to introduce Dave and have him give his just a short background of what I haven't given. In absentia, I'd like him to introduce his co-author and his background. And then we'll open up the line of questioning. And as you know from previous programs, I like to call these not fireside chats, but I tend to turn them into fireside spats in an intellectual way. So without further ado, David Moschella.
Hey, Frank, good to see you, and great to be with you and your audience. Yeah, just to expand on what you said about me, my role has always been to try to understand the patterns in the digital world, particularly competition and who's winning and why, and what the next phases will look like. And sort of the roots of the book were that so many of the things that we were hearing about technology, that it destroys privacy and spreads information and undermines trust and harms children, and it's just it was basically being blamed for every societal ill. So Rob Atkinson and I, and Rob, like you, I've known for many years, and Rob is the founder of a group called the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, which is the leading digital policy think tank in DC. And I've been working with that group for the last few years. And their role in this is to try to get Washington to believe in technology and pursue a more positive agenda. And I think in many ways, the Beltway area has been the leader in much of the tech bashing in recent years. So Rob and I have been looking at these 40 myths, as you say, for a while, and we compiled them into a bunch of short essays, taking on each one to try to tell a much more balanced and much more positive story about the impact of tech, and really to show that in many cases the tech world is being used as a scapegoat for other societal ills, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
So as I mentioned before, I mean, this is like having 40 children and picking which one, if you had to. I mean, obviously, I wish we had the time to go through all 40, but if we did that, then people wouldn't buy the book. So we want to make sure that we tease them a little bit with the best and some of the understated. So, I mean, if you had to pick one of the children, the 40 children here, that's probably the most profound that, if you never hear from me again or never see me again or don't read the book, I mean, here's one that you really should take home and think about.
We'll give you the liberty. I might pick two.
Okay, that's fine.
The first is that we hear over and over again that technology is changing the world as never before, and that the pace of change is accelerating like never before. And that's just simply not true. That the technology industry is roughly 60 years old. The first mainframe sort of in the early 1960s or so. And if you simply look at the technologies of the 60 years before that, you'll see that they had vastly more impact on society than anything in the digital world. And look back at the period of 1900 to 1960, cars and planes and trains and electricity and appliances and air conditioning and heating and cooling and lighting and clean running hot water. All of these things and many more had far more impact on people's lives than anything going on in the digital world today. And they happen actually much quicker. As I say, the tech world has taken 60 years to get to this point. Many of those technologies caught on in 10, 20 years. And you mentioned television, movies, and radio, and telephones, and all of these things that happened before and that were overwhelmingly beneficial. And so people sort of make the case that things are changing faster and more than ever. And they use that for fear, but we had greater changes in the past. And you have to say they were overwhelmingly beneficial. So that sort of sets the larger picture of why we should be pretty positive about all this. The second one you hear, and you hear it every day now, is how technology and social media is undermining societal trust through misinformation, disinformation, and all that. And that is a classic example to me of scapegoating. If you want to know why societal trust has diminished, well, you can look at what the Catholic Church did and what the Boy Scouts did and the claims about weapons of mass destruction in the world. And you can look at claims about how the Wuhan, COVID was no way that it was a lab accident. And you can look at just across the board of, the financial crisis and all the things going on in the real world where our institutions have basically not told us the truth about things. And the undermining of societal trust and truth comes far more out of the non-digital world than the technology world. But it's very convenient for those people to say, no, it's all those unwashed masses saying things on social media. And they like to talk about QAnon and Alex Jones and all these relatively fringe players rather than core stories. You look at the Hunter Biden laptop story where the entire intelligence community tells us this is Russian information. And in fact, it wasn't Russian disinformation. So citizens have a very good reason to be skeptical and distrustful from both parties for a long, long time. And just blaming it on technology is just the easy way out.
The problem is that the distrust of analysts like you and I is become institutionalized and normalized. So no matter what we say, we're going to have to battle to go in the other direction. I just the first spat area. I just want to rewind and talk about you and I lived through some of these massive technology changes. I mean, we didn't have to be there for the invention of electricity or the telephone, but I mean, we had a couple of those in our boomer lives. For example, we go back about the invention of the browser, for example, and how life-changing that was. I mean, it's a complete game changer. And we could say, to my 28-year-old daughter, you think this is moving fast. You should have seen when the browser was there. But the problem is, to your point, that people look at it in their own time frame. Like my daughter's 28, so when the browser was like ancient history to her. So when she really sees how disruptive technology is being, she sees it in the context of those 28 years that she's been alive. And I could say to her, it's the old, hey, boomer, Jenna, you think technology is moving fast now. You should have been there with the browser. And what does she do? Her eyes roll over and she's like, okay, Dad.
Yeah, and that's true. And that's always been true that, I mean, basically every generation thinks their own times are the most special. And you see that today with every election in my lifetime has been described as the most important election of my lifetime. And they're doing that now. And in some ways, that's just human nature. And in many ways, it's fine and even in a good thing. But if you believe that your own times are so special, it will help you sort of not believe that the fact that previous changes were mostly for the better, it doesn't matter because you're sort of saying, well, my changes are bigger than those. And so it gives you
That's true.
Sort of exaggerated
change envy
thing to worry about. And therefore it contributes to sort of the negative and sort of paranoid mindset.
We'll talk about some of these other things, but the one you were talking about with misinformation, disinformation, call it what you may, I don't disagree that there are, by the nature of the beast, that disinformation is confusing and there's battlefields back and forth. that's always been there as well, as you said. But don't you think that what is different is not the disinformation part, but the velocity with which it's happening right now? I mean, it used to be, it used to be that word of mouth that people would say, I heard a rumor, I saw this. But I mean, the sheer speed and velocity and controlling it. And as a guy who has another business called Weapons of Mass Discussion, the part of the job is people like myself. They're trying to guide the conversations. We've done this in our careers in a direction where it probably should be, or maybe I could argue sometimes that maybe it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, the speed and reach is greater, but of course one can see that as a good thing also.
Mhm.
That, in the old days where the sources of information were controlled, it was much easier to put out misinformation. You look at Russia today. Once you start to control who can put out what, you can say any old thing. And the internet has always been, at least to a significant degree, a check on the false statements of the people in power. So
Mhm.
I would count that. And the other thing is, in terms of speed, nothing's faster than television. Television puts something on there. You look at what happened with Trump on Saturday, and boom, it's right there. And so that element's been there a long time, and I don't think is changed fundamentally. So, again, I come back to, you can find cases where bad ideas spread quickly, but I think if you look at it on balance, that's more likely to be a check on misinformation than an amplifier of it. But there's clearly both.
Really true.
I mean, you look at the fact-checking world and how quickly stuff can get out there now that never really happened in the past.
And everybody's still looking for the proverbial central source of truth that's really not out there. So I mean we'll get to this because my audience is largely people looking at us or listening to us right now are largely healthcare IT folks. We'll have some other people that are in other areas of healthcare. They look at it somewhat differently in terms of central source of truth as their brand. That I'm Mayo Clinic, I'm Cleveland Clinic, and the brand will provide the central source of truth because it's one of the most sophisticated organizations in healthcare in the world. So I'm wondering, in that regard, with your myths, what would be some of the ones that would be most pertinent to healthcare? And I'll bring up one and I think you agree. You might have mentioned it before. The privacy and patient data. Are there any myths or scapegoats in that area where we could say, data privacy is a scapegoat?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at what's written about privacy, virtually all of the commentary is about the downsides, the way people can be tracked and profiled and targeted, and the risks of data getting out there and the potential harms of that, and surveillance and social credit and all of these things that are very real. And you look at China and you can see some of the downsides that potentially that are there. And so the privacy risks are quite obvious and quite clear and get plenty of attention, as they should. The problem is the privacy benefits get almost no attention whatsoever. And those are extremely valuable in the healthcare world.
Give me an example.
Yeah, sure. I mean, every time people have take healthcare and gender and sexuality issues, they're very sensitive. And if people have an issue, a symptom, a question, they're not going to go run to their physician every single time. So what did they do in the past? Well, they often lived in complete ignorance, or maybe they try to find a magazine or a book to find things out. But the ability to do a search on my own symptoms, my own conditions, my own inclinations, my experiences, and to do that in effectively extremely confidential way is of tremendous privacy gains to people. And so I think people really don't factor that in. Again, it's a question of balance. And for most people, they're essentially making a bet. They're saying, all right, if I enter this question into Google, the servers of Google remember that and they have that in their system. But the odds of that query, that search coming back to embarrass me or to haunt me or get exposed in any way are so much lower than if I ask a friend, a colleague, or someone about these things. And so that there's a reason people go to Google and all kinds of websites to ask confidential things, is because they believe that the risk of that information coming back to harm their privacy is actually extremely low. And so people are voting with their feet. And when you look at that, I mean, those sort of privacy gains are literally for, well, hundreds of millions of people in America and billions worldwide. And all right, so those are big numbers. Well, how many people have been harmed by that? Well, that's a hard number to get, but it's way orders of magnitude smaller. So again, it's not to dismiss the fears, it's not to dismiss the downsides, it's not to regulate some of those things, but to keep such a sense of balance that if you took away people's right to ask sensitive questions to the web, people would be really upset because they know, is there anybody out there who hasn't done a search of something confidential about themselves or a loved one?
Well, there's a certain irony to this, Dave, and you know it yourself, is that as you know, and many people who've seen this program, I had my own stint of 100 days as an inpatient, and I spent a lot of time with COVID advocacy groups. The amazing thing is that despite the warnings about privacy, how open people are when they get into discussion groups about their ailments, which is it's so much more open than doing a Google search, which is relatively confined. So people, the thing is that people are willing to sacrifice the privacy for truthful information that somebody can empathize with. So some of this doesn't even have a bearing on Google or anything else. It's knowing when you've crossed the line and now you're outed. So one of my guests, I've had two previous guests. One was on hacktivism, how hackers are arguing about Hamas and Ukraine and things like that. And the other one was a lady by the name of Jackie Sanchez, who's a great friend, and she runs Planned Parenthood of Southwest Florida, the technology side of it. And she was talking about where that line is crossed in terms of the cybersecurity aspects of reproductive rights.
Yeah.
So because there's some scary things that were happening out there with her and her constituents, that if you said something or you went on Google Maps or something and did this and somebody broke in, they would see that you're crossing state lines to get an abortion. So the scary aspects of that, and I'm not saying this happens, and again, the scale of that is not universal, but the fact is that in Florida, if you're crossing to Alabama or you're crossing to one that will let you do it, there are some pretty profound aspects to this. Thank you for listening to Health Stealth Radio. My producer always wants to strangle me because I always forget to put a shameless plug in here. I'm with Dave Moschella, who is a great author. We've discussed his book, and thank you for your support of Health Stealth Radio. We hope you continue following us. And now back to Dave.
Yeah, without doubt. And, there are real issues that, one of the things I like to stress to sort of bring this out is they've had a lot of hearings in DC about privacy. And if you watch any of those hearings, you will see the Congress people, senators, whatever reps, whatever they are, and their questioning is so hostile and so accusatory that the whole discussion becomes one of sort of, let's get through this thing and clam up, and whether it's Zuckerberg or any of the top people, they get in there, they just want to get out of there. And they say, we've got some issues, we'll do better, we'll try. And they don't really go anywhere. And one of the things, if the conversation was different and the people said, hey, we really like some of the privacy gains that the internet, provides, but there's some issues we should work on. We're not here to bash you about this. We're here to work with you. You might actually get something done. But the whole thing becomes so overly inflamed and hostile that it doesn't go anywhere. And by all accounts, that's just it's just a bureaucratic exercise that's done relatively little, but essentially America has ceded the field in that area, and people start to say, well, maybe that might happen again with AI and some other areas. And so it's one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time with the policy group in Washington, because that really determines how America deals with a lot of these issues.
Don't you feel that a lot of the people, when you watch these hearings, it's incredibly painful to watch, not because of the blame game, but because they're so ill-informed. They might have a bench full of millennials and Gen X or whatever, but they just ask really stupid questions about technology. No interview or anything in healthcare, especially, can be complete without really talking about the generative AI phenomena and the debate of whether it's good, it's bad, it's hallucinating or not. What's the myth, the scapegoat, or what's the point of view that you as the authors have?
Well, the AI one is classic because, computer scientists have been trying to develop artificial intelligence, or what I prefer to call machine intelligence, because it's not really artificial. It's a machine that's pretty smart. And they've been working on that for really their entire length of the computer industry since the 50s. It's always been the holy grail of what they're trying to build. How smart can we make these machines? And just as they start to actually be able to do that, everybody turns against it and says, oh, wow, you shouldn't be doing that. And yet, first of all, there's no stopping it, that people are going to continue to push that field because competition and everything takes them that way. And second of all, they shouldn't. And I always, I think you can sort of sum up the situation as essentially real benefits and speculative fears. That the actual fears are things that, it's going to destroy human worth, and it's going to put us all out of jobs, and it's going to control us and go rogue, and one person will control the world, and all of these things that are plausible scenarios that maybe someday possibly could happen, but there's no real evidence that they are. And history suggests that they will absolutely not. The one thing I would make is that in every field today, whether it's medicine or chess or strategy or anything else, the combination of machines and people outperform just a machine or just a person.
I think the question I wanted to ask you, which is tied in with what you were saying, and also with the work that you're doing in Washington, where do you see the government coming in with governance on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I hope they sit back and watch for a while, because I would make 2 points. The first is that existing laws cover a lot of things, that there are laws for liabilities and fraud and copyright violations and all of these things. So the first thing is, how well can existing laws be applied rather than trying to write entirely new ones? And I think that's really important. The second thing about it is that we have to realize that we need all the AI we can get, that we're heading into a world of an aging societies, in many cases sharply declining populations in Japan and Korea and much of Europe and other places. And so we basically are going to need all the automation that we can get in many areas. And if you look at Japan and South Korea are probably the 2 biggest examples of it. They know that they need automation, they need robots just to maintain their society over the next 20 and 30 years as their populations start to rapidly shrink. In terms of governance, I would say but basically they should deal with problems as they emerge rather than trying to write blanket laws. You look at something like deep fakes, all of these issues in the election and other things. And it turns out, even though deepfakes are incredibly good, that they haven't. But over time, laws will emerge in that particular area, what you can do in terms of copying Taylor Swift or Scarlett Johansson. I would say that the main thing with governance is to not try to write blanket AI laws. Try to write targeted ones. What does it mean to copyright? What does it mean to identity theft? What does it mean to fair use? And all of these things that I think will play out over time. It'll be real issues. The title of the book is Fears and Scapegoats. And when I talk about trust, that was a scapegoat. This one's one of just fear. And when people say, it's an atomic bomb moment, it's a Frankenstein sort of thing, it's HAL in 2001, it's all of these sort of deeply rooted fears that people have about technology going out of control. And we don't want to have AI non-proliferation. We need AI. And so that whole mindset of governance is wrong. And I think, there was a lot of talk about doing a lot of things to control AI years ago, but I think you've noticed that it really hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think there's been more damage done by Google Translate in the advertising business, where I used to be, as I ran international, people having their corporate brochures translated into German using Google Translate it goes back to your point, without human intervention. Like, okay, here's the translation, I'm going to send it over to our German subsidiary. I think one of the most important points that you made is, which is the constant debate, that artificial intelligence is going to put people out of work. And I think the point you made is really, just to magnify it a little bit, is that it's not, in the places that you mentioned, in other places, it is the workforce that they don't have, as opposed to knocking people out of the workforce. It's filling that gap. So I'm begging you to come in with robotic process automation to fill the gaps that I just can't fill myself.
Absolutely. And it's a huge issue that worker shortages are the reality. And they come at a time where we also need to make these enormous transitions to a non-carbon economy to more sustainable
Mhm.
food to rebuilding torn cities and nations and cleaning up the environment and improving. So there's so many enormous societal challenges that sometimes I think that we actually do need to take out about half of today's white collar workforce so they can go do other things that need to be done. And these giant office towers full of white collar workers, in the short term, it isn't changing much at all, but in the long term, it almost should change and probably does have to change. And, maybe those office towers become vertical farms. And so I think people underestimate the needs of the future, particularly given what I said before about aging and shrinking populations.
Mhm.
The American population isn't shrinking because of the levels of immigration, but most developed nations are looking at serious declines. Automation is also the key to productivity and therefore wages and many things. And fear of automation is, of course, the other great fear, going all the way back to the Luddites and essentially every innovation that's ever come up. The immediate reaction is, oh, it's going to put people out of work. But the reality is we have worker shortages.
Mhm. You come up with a list of 40 things and people say, but wait, how about this one? Are you taking nominations for the next 40? In healthcare, so interoperability is it's huge. And one of the great quotes that I heard was that interoperability is not a technology problem.
Well, that happens to be an issue. I have a lot of firsthand experience. But you mentioned I used to work for the services company DXE. Well, your basic point of interoperability is much more of a human short-term problem than it is a technical one. But the technical transitions to get there do take time, effort, and expense, and those are often lacking, and so you don't get it. But your first initial question about other myths is funny, because when Rob and I started the book, we said, all right, let's come up with 100. And we started trying to make a list of 100, and we sort of got there. And then we said, all right, let's narrow it down to 50. And we had 50, but then we realized that 40 was going to take up 300 pages to do. So we went with 40, with sort of the, 40 days and 40 nights, or top 40, whatever. We went with that sort of metaphor, but there are definitely others. We had many other candidates, but we tried to pick the 40 that we thought were best.
Well, I think we're approaching our time here. I could ask a bunch more questions, and I'm hoping that as this transpires, that you do the next 40, and we get to see that on the digital version of the book. Until we get to a point where you could update a print book in real time. So I'd like to thank you for your time, Dave. Your friendship, and it's just been great. And hope we could bring it back again as a subject matter expert, especially on the regulatory side, because we're doing a lot of work at Chime in that area on both cybersecurity, privacy, and artificial intelligence. So. Thank you again, and we look forward to having you again on the program.
Thank you, Frank. Always great to see and work with you. It's like old times. Good to see you, man.
It is. We'll do that again.
Thank you for joining us today in the shadows for this episode of Health Stealth Radio with Frank Cutitta. If you like the program, please be sure to share your comments on our social media sites, or feel free to contact us with suggestions for new and stealthy show themes. We look forward to welcoming you again for our next broadcast. In the meantime, stay safe out there.